Surah 8. This surah, though usually regarded as having been composed shortly after Badr, cannot be a unity. Verse 11 through 14, 25, 50, 54 have a different rhyme from that of the rest of the surah, and we've previously explained why that doesn't necessitate such things. And the different directions as to the disposal of the spoil in verse 1 and 42 show that some interval must have elapsed. If we can accept Tabari's statement, 1, page 1362, that the principle of the fifth of the spoil belonging to Allah was first applied in the case of Bani Qaynuqa, that the interval would not be very long, but in view of Surah 59, that may be perhaps questioned. It is impossible to unravel the composition with certainty, but verse 1, which claims the spoils for Allah, probably dates from shortly after the victory of Badr. Verse 7, 8, 17, 43 to 46 support the claim of verse 1 by pointing out that the battle and the victory were due to Allah's disposition and contrary to the natural inclinations of the Prophet's followers. They will, therefore, date from about the same time. Verse 15 looks like an exhortation to his followers immediately before the battle. Now, all that talk about you may like something that's not good for you and you may hate something that's good for you kind of indicates that their inclinations weren't just fulfilled by approval via revelation. They will, therefore, date from about the same time. Verse 15 looks like an exhortation to his followers immediately before the battle. Verse 18 and 19 look like an exultant defiance to the Meccans immediately after it. Verse 29, with its promise of the Furqan, is almost certainly earlier than Badr, for in verse 42, the Furqan is interpreted as having come on the day of Badr. Verse 30 to 35 look like a philosophy of Allah's dealing with the Meccans. Verse 35 would perhaps have a reference to some special act of worship on the part of the Quraysh after their defeat, but the verse is somewhat isolated, and if the original end of the passage were 55, 56, it is possible from the sense the whole passage, apart from 35, might be earlier. Verse 36 was almost certainly occasioned by the news of the Quraysh having set apart the value of the rescued caravan for the purpose of a punitive expedition against the Muslimin. Verse 37, 38 might go with this, but the connection is not very good, as they would join equally well to 28 and may have stood on the back of 36. If so, they form the conclusion of an appeal for obedience which runs through this early part of the surah and may have been written on the back of earlier passages. It begins with verse 2, which may have been the continuation of verse 1, but more probably was written on the back of that verse, which must have been discarded, and continues with verse 3, 4 on the back of 5, 6. Where's this idea that stuff's written on the back of this part, but not that? It's like people wrote on both sides of the paper, and there's no indication that, you know, the way it's talked about here kind of sounds weird, which are here out of connection. Verse 9 and 10 are usually taken as referring to the help of the angels at Badr and might support the claim of verse 1, but it is curious that in verses 43 to 46, which quite evidently refer to Allah's part in the Battle of Badr, it is set on quite other grounds than the help of angels. While we have seen that Muhammad promised his followers such help at Uhud, and afterwards explained that away in words similar to those used in verse 10, 322, the fact that the question may be raised whether verses 2 through 4, 9, 10, 20 to 23, 24, 26, 27, 28, 37, 38 do not form the mild address which Muhammad delivered to his followers after Uhud. Surah 3, 153, refer to that. Whether a date from this time or earlier is a little doubtful. Now, does he use his own numbering or does he use the actual numbering of the verses in referencing the different passages? On the whole, the reference to the Furqan makes it probable that the verse was composed not too long after Badr. The other verses would be more appropriate when the Muslimin were in position of having lately won a victory than after a defeat. The date of 47 to 49 is quite uncertain, as the admonition they contain would be appropriate as almost any time during the war with Mecca, but if, as seems probable, they were written on the back of 51 to 54, they might be considerably later than Uhud. The passage 51 to 56 is very difficult. It is not a unity that is evident from the different rhyme of 54 and the similarity of 54 to 56. It is not tempting to regard 55 and 56 as a duplicate of 53, 54, but this does not explain the change of rhythm in 54, which is also rather isolated. It seems preferable to expose that 54 was a stray verse fairly early required for the writing of 47, 49, which passage 51 to 53 by itself was rather short. This latter must in its present form date from after Uhud, but 51 would be complete in itself, and the duplicate designation, hypocrites and those in whose hearts this disease, suggests that a former is an insertion and that verse 52, 53 have been added when the insertion was made. The somewhat accidental presence of 54 with its different rhyme would then explain the occurrence of the same rhyme in addition to 47 to 49. These are 50, and also is present in other verses of the surah, which may have been inserted at the same time. 11 through 14 and 25. Verse 11 is regarded as referring to rain, which fell during the night before Badr. But if also the above assumption be correct, the verse must be much later. The reference must be to the storm of rain which completed the discomfiture of the Quraysh with their allies at the trench, so that 11 through 14 would deal with that event. Verse 25 would also quite appropriately refer to the fitna caused by the adherence of Bani Qurayza to the allies. Verse 50, which is also usually made to refer to Badr, would quite well refer to the same event. That the surah does contain verses so late as the day of the trench is also made certain by the passage 57 to 64 with its reference to those who always break their covenant, the Qurayza, who were to be so dealt with as to terrify those behind them, and others with whom peace is to be made if they incline to it, the Quraysh and their allies, whom Muhammad tried to buy off by negotiation. The passage is wholly addressed to the prophet except verse 62, which is addressed to the believers, and which we may suppose to be the order for the attack on the Qurayza after the allies had drawn off. This is the first occasion on which we hear of the Muslimin possessing horses. Verses 65 to 72, on the back of which 57 to 64 have been written. See, most of these introductions is taken up by this baseless speculation of editing. Contain a series of passages which date from shortly after Badr, but which have been revised in the interval. Again, no evidence of revising, no editing. Muhammad learned a passage, he said where it went, that's it. No indication of anything else. Whether verse 5, 6 originally followed 65 is a little doubtful, but 67 is evidently a later modification of 66. Whether 70 is a later addition to 68 and 69 after permission to take a spoil has been given is doubtful. It is more probably a stray verse on the back of which was required along with 68, 69 for the writing of 62, which must have been inserted after the rest of the preceding passage was composed. The close of the Surah 73 to 76 dealt with relationships and originally constituted an equivalent of tribal relationship between the Muhajirin and the Ansar. At some date, however, modifications have been induced. The first form may belong to about the time of Badr, or shortly after, or even earlier. The modifications are at any rate later than Uhud. Verse 73b denies to believers outside of Medina any right to expect protection unless they emigrate, while reserving the right to assist them on religious grounds, provided no treaty stands in the way. The reference to compacts with the tribes outside of Medina implies a fairly late date. Verse 76 deals with the position of those later Muhajirin, which have thus, on political grounds, been encouraged to join the Muslim community in Medina. Surat al-Anfal, chapter of the windfalls, because war, the spoils is the extra. seriously, that's the Islamic approach, is that the spoils of war, the land, the slave, the resources, people that have decided to convert, no forced conversion in Islamic systems, but yeah, so all that is extra stuff and not allowed to be a motivation for war. So we have the spoils belong to Allah and the messenger after Badr, the true believers sometime later, many believers unwilling to fight, followed by verse 65. What happened was by Allah's disposition after Badr, supposing the claim in verse 1. Help comes from Allah after Uhud. So what we had, 1, 5, and 6 believers, followed by 65. Okay. So the windfalls, things beyond what is due, the exact sense of the word is uncertain. It can be taken as referring to the spoil in general, and it relates to the word for voluntary. The right between you, act uprightly between yourselves. And okay, there's another note. The two parties, the Meccan caravan and the armed force sent out to protect it. So say it wasn't that they were just raiding caravans, it was whose caravan it was did they lose property from those people, that sort of thing. Believers not to give way in battle before Badr, verse 15, verse 17. Allah fought the battle after Badr in context of 7 and 8, because the material world carrying out things is, God's ultimately in charge. We're only the means, right? Verse 18, the defiance to the Meccans after Badr. Allah's help to the believers. 11 through 14 here. And, you didn't kill them, but God killed them. And what, that passage. At a critical point in the Battle of Badr, Muhammad threw a handful of gravel towards the enemy. And rain is said to have fallen on the night before the Battle of Badr. But if the passage be a later insertion, the reference is doubtful. And promise to the believers before Badr, 29, an appeal for obedience perhaps followed verse 10, 20 to 23. Private reflections on the punishment of Mecca, perhaps occasioned by the Quraysh, wailing for the dead after Badr, starting at verse 32, and to 35. Continuation of an appeal of the later insertion, 24, 26. Syriac Perkana, salvation, and here probably in that sense. Verse 2, 175, here probably war against the Meccans is implied. Calls to you what you will give you life. See, that's what war is. It's not to make you wealthy, it's to protect life. The continuation of the appeal, 27, 28, 37, 38. The Meccans preparing for an expedition after Badr, 36. The victory was Allah soon after Badr, supporting the claim to spoil in verse 1. So that goes on to 46. War with Mecca and regulation of the spoil sometime after Badr, 30 to 42. The Kaaba is the sacred mosque, so the most sacred place in the world where the prayer is thought to be 100,000 times where it is and elsewhere. And by, of course, then there are those that are also multiplied versus the usual masjid. The citing and sighing the grief of the people who are prevented. The refuge, there's fitna and not sense some danger was threatening the whole community. So all these battles and stuff is about danger. It's not just, oh, we don't believe that, the nonsense that people try to claim. The help in Medina and at Badr. And of course, you're supposed to be thankful for all this. And confidence in God justified after Badr, revised later, 50 to 54, 51 to 54, believers to be steady in battle, date uncertain, probably later than Uhud, 47 to 49. There's a reference to the hypocrites, And there's a reference to the custom of the ancients having gone by. You know, some stuff becomes outdated, of course. You know, the fitna is the persecution. And the day of the criterion, see verse 29. And the salvation here regarded as having come on the day of Badr. Then we have the change in the law's favor due to the change of character, originally the end of, well, along the same as 30 to 34. Remember, it's an effectual text, so 55 and 56. Nothing wrong with it being at that place. Verse 50, connected to 47 through 50, uncertain date after the trench, it was learned. One's responsible for one's neighbors to a degree, their protection, and something at the death. Well, you finally realize some stuff at death, right? The prophet to rely upon Allah after Badr. You know, Allah is a singular and definitive term for God in Arabic. The prophet to encourage believers to fight after Badr, 66 and 67. The perfidy of some with whom an agreement has been made, the Beni Qurayza, 57 earlier, 57 to 61. Edition when above was published, 62. So becoming heavy or languid, what's the reference to becoming heavy or languid? Oh, causing havoc, okay. Prisoners to be allowed to be ransomed and returned to Mecca, 71 and 72. And 63 to 64 relates to 57 to 61. Ties a relationship with the unbelievers to be cut off probably between Badr and Uhud, 63b later. There's a writing or decree, so a book. Those that have been left in their homes in Mecca or elsewhere and joined with the Muslim community in Medina. So talking about the immigration situation. Blood relation closer to that of Muhajirin to Ansar, 75, possibly the same date, 73a, 74, 76, certainly later, and perhaps at the same date as 63b. And so again, the help, Ansar, you know, the people who weren't the immigrants, helping the immigrants, and the friends, probably in the sense of the next of kin, upon whom rests the duty of the blood revenge. Constitution of Medina, 1, Hasham, page 342. And there's this designed to encourage immigration and so to strengthen the Muslimin in Medina. So that was going on there. And remember that some people were, when part of the Quran was learned, whether somebody composed a manuscript or came with it memorized, people were sent off before the Quran was completely learned to spread the Quran. Oh, go teach this chapter to these people. And sometimes they wrote it down first, sometimes didn't. But Surah 9, this is a chapter of war proclamations and contains passages from several different dates. The absence of the Bismillah is probably due to the fact that it begins with a heading announcing that which follows is a proclamation in the name of Allah, as is evident from verse 1 and 3a. Two documents are here interwoven. The first is probably the denunciation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and consists of verse 1, 4, 7a, 8, and possibly also 13 to 15, 17, 18. The latter passages are in any case connected with the renewal of the war with Mecca, the former exhorting the Muslimin to fight, the latter laying down what was probably one of the objects of the war used to get possession with the Kaaba and the holy places. With this has been combined a proclamation intended to be made at the pilgrimage with, which must, however, therefore date after the conquest of Mecca. The pilgrimage intended was probably that of the year 8, which fell a few months after that event. This proclamation consists of verses 1, 3a, 4, 7a, 7b, 12, 14, 15, 16, 19 through 22, 25 to 28. The inclusion of some of these verses is a little doubtful. The passage of 19 to 22 was certainly not originally composed for this purpose, but seems rather designed to allay the disappointment of the Medinan followers at finding that after all, the management of the holy places remained in the hands of the Meccans, who now professed Islam. Verse 28, which forbids the polytheists to come to the Kaaba, formed probably the point and conclusion of the proclamation. These documents have been partly written on the back of discarded verses, which now also stand intermingled with them. For further discussion, this JRAS 1937, page 233, Journal of Asiatic Studies, or of Religious and I don't remember the name. Verses 29 to 35 form in effect a proclamation of war against Jews and Christians. It probably belongs to the year 9, when an expedition was designed for the north, which would involve war with the Christians and possibly with the Jews, not for being Christians or Jews, but the passage might, however, be earlier. The opening verse, in fact, hardly seems to have been originally meant to apply to the people of the book, and is just as possible as verse 33 was the original end of 29, which the present 29b, 30 to 32 have been substituted. The regulations of the calendar in verse 36 and 37 is usually placed very late, but it is improbable that Muhammad would carry on a war with the Meccans for long and at the same time continue to recognize their fixing of the sacred months. The passage, in fact, originally consisted of 36a, 2, 5 belonging to the early days of the war with Mecca. 2 and 5 were discarded, and 36b, 37 substituted at some later time, which cannot be determined. The following passage, which originally consists of 38, 129, 40, also belonged to the first years of the war with Mecca. The substitution of verse 39 may have been made at the same time as the alteration of the preceding passage. The peremptory note of 41 marks it as still later. It may have been added when the following verses were composed. These 42 to 48 clearly have reference to the expedition to the north, year 9, also 49. Verse 49, verses 53 and 54 belong probably to this time. Verse 50 to 52 and 55 to 64 seem to be taken from an earlier discourse against the hypocrites and have been revised for use at this time. This is confirmed by the occurrence of what is evidently a discourse against the hypocrites in verse 65 to 69, 74 to 81, into which 72 and 73 have been later inserted on the back of 70 and 71 by the way of balance. Verse 75 tempts one to associate this discourse with the covert threat to expel Muhammad, said to have been uttered during the expedition against the Beni Mustalik in the year 6, but the use of the words Surah and An-Nabi in the Punctilious designation of male and female seem to belong to an earlier time, and verse 66 seems rather to refer to some gibe against the revelations. It may be that to some still earlier scraps have been utilized. Verse 74 seems to have dealt originally with the unbelievers and to have been adapted, for otherwise there is no reason why they should be mentioned here. Verses 82 to 86 deal with some who have failed to join in an important expedition. This is said to have been the expedition to the north, Tabuk, but verse 84, taken in conjunction with 48:15, suggests that it was the expedition to Hudaybiyah, in which also many failed to take part. Possibly the passage was repeated on the second occasion with the substitution of the present end of 82 for 83, the original ending. Verse 85 and 86 may belong to this latter time. Verse 82 to 84 was written on the back of 89 and 91, a passage which was originally earlier, but was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised by omission of 88, 89, and the insertion of 91 was revised of 87b, 91, verse 85 and 86 corresponds to 92 to 94, which 93 has been inserted later. The difficulty of finding amounts for willing warriors was more likely to be felt at the time of Hudaybiyah than after the conquest of Mecca, and the victory of Hunain. Verses 95 to 97 are alternatives corresponding to the three strands in 82 to 91. Verse 98 probably belong to the same time as 91, but later have been added, modified by the addition of 100, 104 to 106, written on the back of 101, which is quite out of connection. 102 to 107, the modification must be pretty late if 107 stood in its present position when it was made. For a while, 102, 103 may belong to the same time as 98 and 99. The probability is that 107 was added when that passage was also repeated after the return from Tabuk. This time belongs also 108, 109, which probably, though not quite certain, stood on the back of two extraneous early Medinan passages, 112, 113, which probably themselves show revision, and 114, 117. After a time, those referred to in 107 were forgiven, this being announced that in a modification in an early Medinan passage, 118, 119, verse 120, which is out of connection, was needed to give space for a part which is out of connection was needed to give a space for a part of 119. The latest parts of the surah, verses 121, 122, 123, were written on the back of much earlier passages, which were probably belonging to the time when Muhammad was engaged in persuading his followers to fight. Now, if they knew of things being written, this sort of thing that they're talking about, then they'd know the time and stuff like this, because the manuscripts would exist. So seems rather silly, but Surat At-Tawbah or Surat Al-Bara'ah, chapter of repentance or chapter of the renunciation. Renunciation of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, revised as a proclamation to be made at the pilgrimage following the conquest of Mecca. And 3a connects to one additional heading for the proclamation. And verse 2 is connected to 36a and 3b. They're not sure where to put it in their little game there, but we know that, quite a bit of it, like half the chapter was taught, and then the rest of it was taught, and Ali was sent rushing off to teach the rest of the chapter. The greatest day of the pilgrimage, so was at the 10th of the 12th month, but the pilgrimage on the 12th month of days 8 through 10, usually longer, but that to fulfill the requirements, there's those 3 days you must be there taking part at this particular time. Followed verse 2, verse 5, followed verse 1, verse 4, and 7a. Additional in the proclamation, 7b, 6, same time as verses 2 and 5. Detached, 9 and 10 and 11. 9 and 10 are thought to refer to the Jews. 8 is linked to the proclamation. 7b, linked to the proclamation. The Kaaba, the sacred mosque, which must have been in the hands of the Muslimin. Well, whether or not you say that that's the case, whether you said it happened before or after, the protection of the places of worship. How can you have a treaty with those who will not guarantee safety for the places of worship that you would attend, right? The exhortation to resume the war with Mecca may have been included in the proclamation as impressing the duty of the fighting on new converts. Verse 13 then not included, and verse 16 later included, so 13 through 16. The object of the renewed war with Mecca, the sacred places, must be in the hands of the Muslimin. Inclusion of the proclamation, doubtful. 17 and 18. 19 to 22, you have the answer to the murmurs of his followers of the management of the Kaaba being left to the hands of the Quraysh, possibly included in the proclamation as an exhortation to the Meccans. Islam overrides relationships in prospect of renewed war. So, if you're aggressors and oppressors, it doesn't matter if they're family or whatever, that's verse 23. the visit, you know, the visitation, and perhaps it's more than the place of the pilgrimage, but the management is actually how most render the verse, because it does actually mean more than just going to a place. So it kind of tells you, don't just justify the Saudis because they print some books and have taken charge of the 2 sacred cities. You know, find more reason for that. A stronger version of the above, probably about the same date, verse 24. Encouragement to fight. Allah's help at the Battle of Hunain belongs to the proclamation, 25 to 27. The polytheists debarred from the Kaaba, the end of the proclamation. People still fake it, but at the very least, you can say that Islam bans people from that one place. Just like the Sikhs, if you're not Sikh, and they find out you're not Sikh, you're not allowed to go to the Golden Temple in the Punjab or wherever that thing is. Mecca depended to a considerable extent on revenue from the pilgrims. So there was the worry that if it's the monotheism succeeds, then the money from the pilgrimage and the idols and the soothsayers and all that's the ritual for hire and all that was going to go away. And the money didn't go away, just, you know, those professions no longer held their sway there. The people of the book to be subdued. So starting with verse 29, in preparation for the expedition to the north, year 9. And so given the book, the position of the phrase suggests that it may have been interpolated, or well, again, they're just presuming the same stuff was done with the Bible. And they have evidence for the Bible that's happening, but unilateralism or whatever it's called, or the verse probably earlier added that thing. The tribute, a distinction was drawn between jizya, poll tax, and kharaj, land tax, which turned out to be actually lower than modern taxes. The exact meaning of this phrase is uncertain. Okay, what is the phrase? Okay, the day when they, their treasures, the Uzair, Ezra, because some things were said about some prophets and stuff. The offhand. Yeah, so the ruling hand, the jizya basically indicates who's in charge. It's not to disgrace him or something. It's just to say, hey, the Muslim, we have a Muslim government, or at least Muslim rulers now. So the war of the polytheists, the sacred months, early Medinan, 36 and 37, a version of the believers to war, early Medinan, 38, 39, 40, it's 129 relates to those, and 41 before the expedition to the north. The right religion, the eternal religion, the perennial religion, connecting to verses 2 and 5. Again, there's no evidence of any of this shifting of the order. They're just saying how they would write it, as perhaps a Christian going in Genesis to Exodus, a Genesis to Revelation sort of thing. Keeping the months according with the season, a month was intercalated occasionally, and when this should be done was decided at Mecca. And well, no, they gave up on, Islam gives up on this to, one, enable that the difficulties and ease of the different calendar-based religious observances don't give eternal superiority in some way or other. Whatever reason God does it. It's not, the fasting, whether the longest days or the shortest days or the easiest or the coldest or the hottest was the easiest or the hardest. The pilgrimage, are you doing pilgrimage when it's 130 degrees out or when it's 90s? There's some varying with this stuff. The second of two, Abu Bakr. But people would be like, in order to serve an agenda, they would throw in an extra week or an extra month or whatever. That was the real danger being pointed out. Interviews with unwilling warriors, probably originally private during the preparations for the expedition to the north. Oh, there's a lot more information in the Hadith being passed on, and most of it was, yeah, kept eternally private, more or less. Verse 42 to 48, a moderate journey aiming at a definite object. They would run about in the midst of you, and not tempting, sedition, by refusing to see them. So 50 and 51, passage from an earlier date, now related with 52 and 51. Okay, oh, and 52, okay. So just 50 is thought by this guy to be by itself at some point. Their contributions not acceptable to God, 53 and 54. If you're given the opportunity to willingly give your alms, whether it's the zakat al-fitr towards the end of Ramadan, 4 double heaping handfuls of grain or nuts or fruit or something like that. And the 40th of your income through the year, and the mining thing and all that stuff. But if you're reminded of it and you refuse, and there can come a time where it's just not collected, even though it's owed, even though it doesn't count, it doesn't fulfill it, but it's owed. It's not a good situation. Now people who are alive can repent, but you know what I mean. 55 to 57 of earlier date based on an earlier passage. 58 through 60, division of the sadaqah, the charity, possibly of an earlier date, revised with addition to verse 60. So the zakat is thought to be something different. So the goods, the victory leading to the death or virtue reward, the voluntary contributions of the community. So say the sadaqat, which differs from the zakat. The zakat can't go towards as many things as charity in general can. The prophet was accused of spying, earlier doubtful if repeated. Well, he was accused of of taking advice to everyone and all that sort of stuff, which he did have a sort of democratic spirit. Right and wrong aren't decided democratically. What to finally do isn't exactly a popularity vote, but and they accused the prophet of stuff, but they just jumped to stuff because it didn't go their way. Don't accuse people of stuff because it doesn't go your way. Protestations of no avail, 63 and 64, discourse against the hypocrites after Uhud, but exact date uncertain, 65 to 69. The unusual position of the phrase in the second occurrence probably indicates that it's been inserted at the revision. Allah and his messenger, okay. An unusual phrase. But again, no indication of revision. Merits of the believers, 72 and 73. Well, you need context. You need the right and the wrong and what's going to happen and how good it is or how bad it is, that sort of thing. The Meccans have earned Allah's disfavor early in Medina, so 70. Just because you're at the best of cities or best, of the tribes of one of the best people doesn't mean, example, in former times, 71 to 75, Meccan. And so their hands are shut. So the hypocrites are shutting their hands. If you're listening to this in Ramadan, remember, figure out the sort of thing beyond your needs of what you've been acquiring, and give. Now some people like to spread it out throughout Ramadan, said $150 here or $20 here or whatever the case is, donate something. And you know, $1 a day or whatever. Figure out what your actual amount is, and don't hold back the their niggardliness, you know, the stinginess. It doesn't relate to the other word, 76 to 79, and the voluntary contributions, of course, the sadaqah. Just translate the term. Quran translators translate the term. Even if you need a whole sentence to translate some verse or some word in some verse, do it. Don't make us learn 300 Arabic words and make it vary per people. It just needs to stop. The juring at poor Muslimin. Not that I don't know what almost all these words mean, because, you know, having you refer to the footnotes is just plain annoying. It may encourage some people, it's going to chase some people away. But what do Orientalists care? The treatment of those who stayed behind during the expedition to Hudaybiyah, or that to Tabuk. So verses 82 to 85. Reluctance to fight, originally fairly earlier, before the battle to Hudaybiyah, 87 to 91. The shortness of the one verse suggests that it was originally right after, you know, verse 83 was the end of 82, which presence it has been substituted. The verses vary in length, even within the same period, even within the same chapter. The division is according to what Muhammad said they were. It doesn't suggest any editing or whatever they're trying to claim here. Exemption before Hudaybiyah, verse 93, possibly as an afterthought, 92 to 94, and 85 to 86. Their protestations not to be accepted. 96, like 90 or 91, 97, like you know, connecting to 87a and 88. You know, I mean, you know, the meaning, you go back and forth and you're hearing the thing, and yeah. So inflicting the punishment, what is the thing here? Verse 90, there's no opening. 95, relating to 86, 84, 85, 86. Attitude of the Bedouin, date uncertain, but originally perhaps about the time of Hudaybiyah, verses 98 and 99. Fairly early of the Medinan, 101, and 100, and the Bedouin, verse 102, 103, at the time of 98, 99. Well, basically we have an indication that there might have just been 2 days where this chapter was learned in, or something like that, like part was learned and then it wasn't too long and rushed off with the other half of the chapter. I'm not sure exactly how that defines, but verse 128 and 129 were apart. You know, these people now, that these submitters trying to claim that they weren't part of the Quran and trying to make doctrines that would throw out parts of the chapter and stuff like this. If you took them to their fuller extent, and it's like, well, if this, then we have to throw out all this other stuff too. But if it turns out that their argument of what they're accusing those two verses of being is not true, then you don't have to follow their other, then you can just take apart that. But 104 to 106, probably still later. Something imposed by force was the tax. So taxes aren't the same thing as charity. And we should set up a charitable society rather than a tax-driven society to address the needs of those who have needs, and the thing, you know, following with well-doing, just like that thing in Surah 2, right? You know, with kindness. So when you do charity, when you help somebody out, don't remind them about how oh, your needs are provided by me, and you know, oh, you don't do nothing, and insulting the people and all that stuff. No, it's better to do nothing than to use your opportunity of handing somebody money as a as a thing. You buy somebody, oh, I'll give you my you know, I noticed you're poor and it's going to help you out if I give you a bag of oranges or something. It's like, now being poor, I've encountered both. I've encountered people that are like, on the other hand, they think that, you know, you're not being too prideful gives them an opportunity. But then there's the people who, like, if you even tag along with them, they say, I'll tag along and you'll get some stuff done as I get some stuff done. And no matter how much you have to wait on them or whatever, they feel like it's the biggest favor in the world and that you die or something if you, without them to help you. And, you know, trying to make you inferior and not feel inferior and that stuff. So the city, Medinat an-Nabi, you know, and the humiliation and death to be followed by punishment of the future life. So things go wrong here. It can continue. 107 added later. The revival at the Mosque of Quba, a return from the northern expedition, 108 to 111. God's bargain with the believers, fairly early. Medinan, 112, 113 to 117. And the standing in it, you know, the prayer, just like you don't stand over the graves of the hypocrites. Well, you can walk through a cemetery, you just don't, you know, the wandering Christians and the monks, you know, there's some things, the reference to the bowing, and so the serving, you know, the worshiping and the truth, the promise of binding, you know, that sort of stuff. Polytheists not to be prayed for. Yeah, I guess we went to that 114, 117. The believers restored to a favor fairly early in Medinan after Uhud, revised some time after return from the northern expedition, 118 to 120. Possibly guided to them is to make clear towards what they should show piety or whose cases were left over. So the people left behind, not the same thing as the Left Behind book, but, you know, so then we have reference to the war, early Medinan, and 125 to the end. But before that, we have believers employed in war by sections later than 121 and 122. And 129, 8 and 129 relate to 40 and 128. But so Medina's the city. There's an emptiness place, any place gone on. You gotta, it's not just pilgrimage, you gotta, it's like one of the 4 things predestined is where you walk. Well, there's a lot of choices about where you walk and how you walk and that sort of stuff, right? Any enemy entertainments among yourselves, so among your people, racially, nationally, whatever. And it's important to Muhammad, just like it was to any prophet and believer and all that stuff, what happens with the people. I care about my legacy. I pray for my legacy. I pray for my impact that maybe doesn't carry on after my death, but the impact in the moment upon other people. Whenever I am in the temple room, I at least daily, if not, you know, 5 times a day or so, supplicate for the witnessing of there and the things that I connect to there that's not there. Like when I visit another place of worship, when I have a religious, a spiritual book or something that I do for my spiritual studies elsewhere, I connect that all to that place of worship. And so it's those who bear witness and those who choose to take part in any of it. I'm praying for that community. And I obviously care what happens there. People have their choice, obviously, and we'll get more into choice and the freedom of religion later in our comments.